All right, welcome to the Afrodescendant Ali channel, and welcome to this special intelligence briefing 123 verses 3, the geography of guilt. Tonight, we're doing something that's not in our feelings. We're doing power. We're breaking down how 123 nations at the UN just declared the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity, and why the United States, Israel, and Argentina chose to stand on the other side of the vote. This session is for our Afrodescendants across the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and the continent who want the real story behind the headlines. Who voted yes? Who hid behind the abstentions? Who voted no? And what that reveals about colonial liability, reparations, and the future of African and diaspora leverage. We're going slide by slide through the numbers: 12.8 million trafficked, 1.8 million dead in transit, 51 African states moving as a unified bloc, 16-0 CARICOM solidarity, and mapping out how this single vote will echo through courts, elections, and geopolitics for decades. If you're tired of being told that this is just symbolic, stay locked in. By the end of this presentation, you'll see exactly why March 25th, 2026 was not about the past at all. It was about who gets to write the rules of the 21st century and why Afrodescendants are finally stepping into that room as creditors, not beggars. Let's start with a number here on the slide that you see on the screen that actually matters: 123. That's how many countries walked into the United Nations General Assembly on March 25th, 2026, and voted to declare that the transatlantic slave trade, they voted that the transatlantic slave trade would be the greatest. That is how many countries walked into the United Nations General Assembly on March 25th, 2026, and voted to declare the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity in recorded history. 123 nations out of 178 that showed up to vote. 3 voted no. 3. The United States, Israel, and Argentina. Now, I want you to hold those two numbers in your head: 123 and 3, because everything I'm about to tell you over the next 20 minutes flows from that gap. That gap is not a moral story. I don't do moral stories. That gap is a structural story. It is a story about who has leverage, who is losing it, who is accumulating it, and who has just publicly announced to the entire planet which side of history they intend to stand on, whether they understand the consequences of that announcement or not. The resolution is called A/80/L.48. It was introduced by Ghana. It passed with 123 in favor, 52 abstentions, and exactly 3 countries in outright opposition. It is non-binding, which means it does not create an overnight legal obligation for anyone to write a check. That is the part of the Western media that they're focusing on. It is also the least important part of the story. What this vote actually did was establish a global moral consensus against the explicit wishes of the most powerful nation on earth. It demonstrated that 123 nations can coordinate, hold discipline, and deliver a supermajority even when Washington is in the room applying pressure. And it put a timestamp on the precise moment the post World War II Western led international order cracked open, not with a bang, but with a vote tally. You're going to hear a lot of commentary about this vote in the next few days ahead. Most of us, or most of it, will focus on the wrong things. Today, we're going to focus on the right one: geography, demographics, balance sheets. That's it. That's everything. Let's go. The crime by the numbers. Before we talk about who voted and why, we need to understand what we're really talking about. Because one of the most effective tools of historical denial is abstraction, keeping the numbers vague enough that the scale never registers emotionally or analytically. So let's be precise: 12.8 million people. That is the number of Africans forcibly trafficked across the Atlantic between approximately 1444 and 1888. 400 years. 12.8 million human beings in their peak productive years. Young adults, overwhelmingly removed from the continent and inserted into economic systems designed to extract their labor until death, with zero compensation, zero legal status, and zero path to exit. 1.8 million didn't even survive the crossing. They died in the hulls of ships, chained together, treated as cargo, not as a side effect of the trade, as an acceptable operating loss of the trade. Now, here is the thing that most people never stop to think about. This was not random. This was not natural disaster. This was not poverty. This was the deliberate, systematic extraction of a continent's most valuable demographic asset, its young labor force. Precisely during the 400 years when Europe was compounding the industrial wealth that still structures global power today. You want to understand Africa's development gap? You don't need a committee. You don't need a study. You need to understand the continent was running a forced labor export program for 4 centuries while simultaneously being denied the capital, the population density, and the institutional development that labor would have generated at home. This is not a grievance, that is a balance sheet. And look at who was running that balance sheet. Portugal shipped 5.8 billion Africans and 45% of the entire trade. The United Kingdom, 3.1 million, France, 1.4 million, Spain, 1.1 million, the Netherlands, 554,000. The United States, as a separate entity, after independence, 420,000. Every single one of those nations either voted no or abstained on March 25th. Every single one. Coincidence is not a geopolitical concept. I put much stock into it. The resolution itself demands formal apologies, a reparations fund, return of cultural artifacts, anti-racism legislation, and it is non-binding, yes, but its function is not compliance today. Its function is legal and moral precedent for tomorrow. We will come back to that. Africa, the unanimous creditor. 51 out of 54. The 3 that didn't vote: Benin, Madagascar, Sao Tome and Principe, were logistical absentees. No plane, No delegation present in the hall. Not a single African nation cast a vote against this resolution. Not one abstained. The African Union moved as a single bloc on the most contested geopolitical resolution in recent UN history. That has never happened before at scale, and it deserves far more attention than it's getting. Now, here's where I need to stop, and I need you to think about that this, excuse me, that this is an emotional response to historical trauma, but it isn't. It is a cold, rational, structurally driven strategic move, and I'm going to show you exactly how. Start with the demographics. Africa has 1.4 billion people today. By 2050, that number reaches 2.5 billion. By 2100, and this is the number that keeps Western finance ministers up at night, Africa will house 4 billion people. That is 40% of all of humanity on one continent, the youngest continent on Earth, with a median age hovering around 19 years old, adding more people to the global workforce every single year than Europe and North America combined. Now, layer that against the rest of the world. Europe is aging off the map. Germany, Italy, Spain, their working age populations are in free fall. East Asia is already past peak population. Even China is shrinking. The United States is holding on through immigration alone, and that immigration pipeline is currently being systematically shut down. Africa is the only region on the planet with structural demographic momentum for the rest of this century, full stop. So when the African Union walks into the UN General Assembly and says, we are formally establishing the legal and moral foundation for reparations claims, they are not looking backward. They're filing a lien on the future. They are doing this now in 2026 because in 2050 and 2070 and 2100, the leverage to demand it will even be greater. You establish precedent before you need to enforce it. That's how legal frameworks work. Think of it this way. Africa was the creditor in a transaction that was never paid. The invoice has been outstanding for 400 years, and on March 25th, 2026, 51 nations just filed that invoice with the international community, formally on the record with 123 co-signatories. The AU's institutional cohesion is also new, and it is significant. For decades, Western analysts dismissed the African Union as a talking shop, all declaration, no coordination. That criticism is now obsolete. A 51-0 unified bloc vote on a contested geopolitical resolution is a demonstration of diplomatic maturity that rivals anything the EU produced in its first 2 decades of existence. The machine is coming online. This will not be the last time it operates at this level. Western Europe and the anatomy of guilt. Now we need to get to the interesting part. Every major former colonial slave trading power in Europe abstained. France, Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, every last one of them. Not a single EU member state voted yes. The EU delivered a formal explanation vote through Cyprus. I want to walk you through that because it is a masterpiece of legal self-protection dressed up as procedural philosophy. And once you understand that what they're actually saying, you cannot unhear it. Objection 1. Using the word gravis implies a hierarchy of crimes against humanity, which has no basis in international law. Translation. If we admit that this is the worst thing, we're admitting that we did the worst thing. We'd like to keep the moral ledger ambiguous. Thank you. Objection 2. Reparations claims are incompatible with established principles of international law. Non-retroactivity is a fundamental cornerstone of the international legal order. Translation: we wrote those laws. We wrote them after 1945, after the slave trade had already ended, and we wrote the non-retroactivity principle specifically to ensure that nothing from the centuries preceding 1945 could ever be litigated against us. This is not neutral legal principle, it is a moat. Objection 3. The proponents refused to consider the wording. We weren't given enough time. Translation: we tried to water it down. They said no, so we're taking our ball and we're going home. Now, I want you to understand why this happened, not just what happened, because the European abstention is not primarily about legal philosophy, it is about fiscal survival. Europe is in demographic collapse. Germany's working age population has already peaked. Italy and Spain are running negative, and native birth rates. France is barely holding at replacement. These governments are staring down the barrel of pension systems that cannot be sustained with current tax bases. And those tax bases are shrinking. Germany is projected to need 400,000 new workers per year for the next 2 decades just to maintain current economic output. It isn't finding them. An aging, contracting population with collapsing tax base does not vote to write generational reparations paychecks. They simply don't have the money, and they don't intend to find out whether they're legally obligated to raise it. Now, let's do individual accountability, because some of these nations deserve specific attention. Britain, 3.1 million Africans transported, the most of any individual nation. Here is a detail that mostly nobody in mainstream coverage mentions. The British government paid £20 million in compensation in 1833 when it abolished slavery, not to the enslaved, to the slaveholders, for their loss of property. That debt was so large, it was financed through public bonds and British taxpayers, including eventually descendants of enslaved people through immigrants, where they were still paying it off in 2015. Let that land. Britain paid the slaveholders. The enslaved got nothing. And on March 25th, 2026, Britain couldn't manage a yes vote. They didn't vote no, too visible. They didn't vote yes, too expensive. They abstained, the geopolitical equivalent of pleading the fifth. March 25th, 2026 is also symbolic because France, 1.4 million Africans transported, but the Haiti story is the one that defines French liability more than any other. When Haiti won independence in 1804, the only successful slave revolution in human history, France refused to recognize the new state unless Haiti agreed to pay 150 million gold francs in compensation to French slaveholders for the loss of their property. Haiti, the newly freed nation, paid that debt from 1825 to 1947. In modern terms, that is approximately 21 billion extracted from the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, paid by the enslaved to their enslavers for the crime of winning their own freedom. And as of March 2026, French military bases have been expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The CFA franc, France's monetary control mechanism, over 14 African nations. The post-independence leash that kept France Afrique functional is under sustained and accelerating pressure. France is losing Africa in real time. Its abstention on this vote does not slow that process, it accelerates it. Portugal, 5.8 million Africans, 45% of the entire transatlantic slave trade, has never issued a formal apology, has never acknowledged financial liability, abstained. 500 years to do the moral math. They chose this. They chose abstention. The 3 no votes. Let's talk about the 3. Because voting no is meaningfully different from abstaining. Abstaining is we don't want to pay and we rather not say that out loud. Voting no is we actively oppose this resolution and we are willing to stand in front of 193 nations and say so. That takes a particular kind of political calculus. Let's look at each one. The United States. The U.S. Deputy Ambassador stated that America does not acknowledge a legal entitlement to reparations for historical injustices that were not deemed illegal under international law at the time they took place. I want to be direct about that. What that argument actually is. It is an argument that the slave trade was legal when it happened, and therefore no obligation flows from it. It is the legal equivalent of saying we can't be held to a standard that didn't exist yet, which is a coherent legal positioning in a narrow technical sense. If you ignore that the people being enslaved didn't get to vote on the legality of their enslavement at the time. But here's what this vote is actually about. At the U.S. level, it's not about legal philosophy. The financial exposure is real. Estimates of U.S. reparations liability range from $14 trillion on the conservative end to $97 trillion on the high end, depending on the methodology. Multiple American cities already have an active reparation program. Several states have pending legislation. A UN resolution declaring slavery a crime against humanity doesn't create automatic legal liability, but it hands domestic litigants a moral and international foundation to build on in U.S. courts and in international arbitration bodies. Washington knows this. They voted no to preemptively close that door. But here's the consequence they apparently didn't fully price in. The United States just told 1.5 billion Africans and the entire African diaspora, roughly 200 million people across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe, who have direct ancestral connection to this history, that it stands against them on the most fundamental question of historical justice. That statement will be quoted in African parliaments, in the Caribbean courts, and in every diplomatic negotiation where the U.S. tries to claim moral leadership for the next decade. You don't get to vote no on the question and this foundational concern and then turn around and claim the moral high ground on anything. This is not a one news cycle event. This is a permanent entry in the diplomatic record. Israel voted with the United States and Argentina and issued no meaningful separate statement. The vote alignment is consistent with Netanyahu's government track record, roughly 85% alignment with the U.S. in UN General Assembly votes, which reflects the structural dependency of Israeli security architecture on American military and diplomatic support. But there is a second layer here that is analytically important. If the international community normalizes the principle that reparations for historical crimes against humanity are legitimate legal and moral expectation, the precedent does not only apply only to to Africans' case, it creates an opening for every ongoing and unresolved historical crime to be relitigated in international forums. Israel, with active ICJ proceedings and an unresolved situation in Gaza and the Palestinian territories, has a direct institutional interest in ensuring that principle does not gain traction. This vote is, in part, Israel voting against the precedent, not just the resolution. Argentina. Argentina, under Milei, is the ideological mirror of the current U.S. administration. Libertarian economics, dismissive of collective historical responsibility, aligned with Western financial institutions, including a $44 billion IMF debt that makes any rupture with Washington financially catastrophic. There is also domestic dimensions to this here that almost never gets discussed in international coverage. Argentina has an Afro-Argentine population estimated at up to 4% of the country, descendants of enslaved Africans who were brought to the Rio de la Plata region during the colonial period. That community has been systematically erased from Argentine national identity. The official consensus barely counts them. Argentine history books barely acknowledge them. The no vote is entirely consistent with that erasure, performed now at the international level in the full view of the United Nations. 3 countries, 1 ideological orbit, 0 willingness to be held accountable by multilateral institutions for anything. This is the shape of the coalition that stood against 123 nations on March 25th. China and Russia, 0 liability, maximum gain. Here is where the geopolitical analysts become almost elegant in its simplicity. China and Russia voted yes. Neither of them has meaningful liability exposure to reparations claims related to the transatlantic slave trade. Neither transported slaves or Africans. Neither operated plantation economies in the Americas or the Caribbean. Neither has a financial stake in the outcome of any reparations litigation that flows from the bill, the resolution A/80/L.48. So, what did it cost them to vote yes? Nothing. Exactly nothing. And what they did have to gain? Let's start with China. China has been running the most methodological long game Africa strategy of any external power in modern history. 53 embassies on the continent, more than any other foreign power on earth. 282 billion in annual trade with African nations. 170 billion in Belt and Road loans, funding railways, ports, dams, hospitals, and telecommunications infrastructure across 40-plus African economies. More than 10,000 Chinese firms currently operating on the continent. Turkish Airlines gets credit for flying the most African cities of any carrier, but China built the airports. The yes vote on A/80/L.48 is not charity. It is not virtue signaling. It is a return on geopolitical investment. For 2 decades, China has methodologically positioned itself as Africa's #1 partner of choice when Western institutions fail, delay, condescend, or impose conditions. Every time The West fumbles on Africa, every IMF structural adjustment that strips social services, every EU trade deal designed to protect European agriculture at African expense, every abstention on a moral question that is foundational, Africa converts that fumble into a first down. The vote cost China nothing. The signal it sent to 54 African governments is worth billions in diplomatic goodwill that takes years to cultivate and can be lost in a single vote on the wrong side. Now, Russia. Russia's calculus is simpler and more desperate. Russia is demographically dying, and I don't use that word lightly. The combination of chronic low birth rates, massive war casualties, and accelerating emigration of young, educated Russians has put the country on a population trajectory that is genuinely catastrophic over the next 30 years. Russia needs African grain markets, mineral partnerships, and security contracts to sustain any semblance of a great power relevance beyond its nuclear arsenal. Russia currently has military or security ties with 43 African nations. It supplies roughly 44% of the continent's arms imports. Its Wagner successor operations are present in Mali, the Central African Republic, Niger, Libya, and Sudan. This is not geopolitical charity. This is Moscow trying to stay relevant in a century where its demographics and geography give it fewer and fewer natural advantages. A yes vote at the UN General Assembly is the cheapest possible loyalty signal to a continent Russia desperately needs. It costs nothing, it signals solidarity, it deepens the relationship, and it reinforces the emerging narrative that positions Russia and China as partners of the global South in opposition to a Western order that historically extracted from and dismissed the same global South. The NATO fracture. This is the slide that should worry Western alliance managers the most. 32 nations make up NATO, the most powerful military alliance in human history, the backbone of the post-World War II Western security order, the institution that has defined transatlantic relationships for 70 plus years. Pardon me. On March 25th, 2026, of those 32 nations, one voted yes, Turkey, one voted no, the United States, 30 abstained, everyone else. On March 25th, 2026, of those 32 nations, one voted yes, Turkey, one voted no, the United States, 30 abstained, that's everyone else in NATO. Now, let me translate that for you. The United States was the only NATO member willing to outright oppose the resolution. Every other U.S. ally, every nation whose security architecture depends on American military guarantees, look at this vote and said, we're not trying to go that far with you. This is not bloc solidarity. That is 30 nations quietly, politely, but unmistakably drawing a line. They will not follow Washington into open opposition on a question this foundational to the Global South's moral agenda. And then there's Turkey. Turkey voted yes, the only NATO member to do so. This should not surprise anyone who has been paying attention to Erdogan's foreign policy over the past decade. Turkey has opened over 60 embassies in Africa. Turkish Airlines flies to more African cities than any other carrier on Earth, over 61 destinations. Turkey's Africa trade has crossed $40 billion annually. Erdogan has been running a deliberate, sustained methodological strategy to position Turkey as a Eurasian African bridge power, independent of both the Western orbit and the Russian orbit. The US vote, the yes vote, is Erdogan telling Brussels and Washington simultaneously NATO membership is a security guarantee. It is not an ideological straitjacket. We retain the right to conduct an independent foreign policy. And our foreign policy says we stand with Africa. That message will land on every other NATO member that is quietly watching the alliance fracture under the weight of American unpredictability. Now, let's look at the other notable outliers, because they tell a story. Serbia voted yes. Despite being an active EU membership candidate, every EU member abstained. Serbia, sitting on the waiting room trying to join the EU club, still broke from the unexpected bloc position. This is Serbia hedging. It is Serbia reminding Moscow and the global south that it hasn't fully chosen its orbit. That flexibility is Serbia's primary diplomatic asset, and it exercised it here. South Korea voted yes. South Korea is one of America's most important Pacific allies, a frontline state in the U.S. containment strategy against China. It hosts U.S. troops. It depends on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. It still voted yes on this resolution. That signals that South Korea's growing Africa trade relationships, $8.5 billion annually, and its own global south positioning outweigh U.S. bloc solidarity on non-security votes. North Korea voted yes, which is predictable. It's Pyongyang's standard anti-U.S. vote at every international forum. Analytically noble, because it means the most internationally isolated state on Earth aligned with the African Union on this question. That tells you something about how globally resonant this vote is. Oman abstained. The only Arab League member not to vote yes, consistent with Oman's decade-long foreign policy of aggressive neutrality. Oman sits between Iran and Saudi Arabia, mediates between the U.S. and its adversaries, and never takes a side it doesn't have to take. Their abstention is a policy statement about policy itself. Western Bloc coherence is fracturing, not dramatically, not all at once, but vote by vote, resolution by resolution. The countries that depend on American security guarantees but have growing trade and diplomatic interests in the global south are beginning to vote their own interests. That process only accelerates from here. Reparations, what the money looks like. Let me address the number that makes Western finance ministers physically uncomfortable. 97 trillion. That is the high-end estimate for total reparations liability flowing from the transatlantic slave trade when you calculate unpaid labor value, economic suppression, compound interest, and the ongoing structural wealth gap. From 1619 to the present, 97 trillion is roughly equal to the entire gross domestic product of the planet Earth in 2024. 1 year of all global economic output. The conservative estimate, U.S. portion only, unpaid labor, 1619 to 1865, no compounding, is 14 trillion. That is still larger than the U.S. national debt was in 2011. No, I'm not telling you these numbers will be paid in full as a lump sum in the next decade. No, that is not how this works. What I'm telling you is that these numbers exist They are cited by credible economists, and every litigator who files a reparations case in any domestic or international court will now cite A/80/L.48 as the moral foundation for that claim. The resolution didn't create the liability existed. The resolution just gave it an international legal home. Let me also tell you about the most extraordinary financial arrangement in the history of the Western Hemisphere, because it is directly relevant to this story. When Haiti declared independence in 1804, it was the first and only nation in history founded by formerly enslaved people through successful revolution. France, which had extracted enormous wealth from Haiti's sugar plantations through enslaved labor for over a century, responded by refusing to recognize Haiti's independence unless Haiti agreed to pay 150 million gold francs as compensation to French slaveholders for the loss of their property. Haiti paid because they had no choice. They took on the debt, paid it with French and American bank loans, and the final payment was made in 1947. 142 years of payments, but by formerly enslaved people, to the nation that enslaved them for winning their own freedom. In today's dollars, approximately $21 billion extracted from Haiti to France. That is what the reparations conversation is actually about structurally. It is not about the abstract historical grievance. It is about a transfer of wealth that is quantifiable, documented, and in some cases, like Haiti, literally still living within their memory. The reparations timeline is not a linear progression toward an inevitable check. It is a slow accumulation of legal and moral precedent, from the failed promise of 40 acres and a mule in 1865 to the Japanese reparations precedent in 1988 to CARICOM's formal reparations commission in 2013 to municipal programs in Evanston and San Francisco to A/80/L.48 in 2026. Each step narrows the legal distance between moral claim and enforceable obligation. The question is not whether reparations will eventually arrive in some form. The question is what form, at what scale, and through which mechanisms. And the vote on March 25th moved those mechanisms several steps forward. The Global South is rehearsing. Here is the framing that almost no mainstream outlet has applied to this vote, and it is the most important frame of all. This was a rehearsal. 123 nations coordinated. They built a coalition across Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. They drafted and introduced a resolution. They held the text firm against pressure from the United States and the European Union to soften the language. They voted in discipline. They delivered a supermajority against the explicit opposition of the most powerful nation on earth. That is a muscle being exercised for the first time at scale, and muscles, once developed, get used again. The post-World War II international order was not designed with this outcome in mind. It was designed in 1945 when the United States was the most uncontested economic hegemon, when Europe was still at the center of global power, and when Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean were largely still colonized or freshly decolonized and economically dependent. The U.S. wrote the rules when it had all the leverage. The UN Security Council structure, the IMF voting weights, the World Bank governance model, the international trade architecture, All of it was designed by and for the Western powers at a specific historical moment that no longer exists. The global South is now home to roughly 65% of all humanity. The G77, the Coalition of Developing Nations, has 134 members. BRICS plus economies now have a combined GDP that exceeds the European Union. The non-aligned movement, which provided that backbone of the 123 yes votes, represents the majority of world's nation states, and a growing share of the world's economic weight. They are accumulating moral precedent, vote by vote, resolution by resolution, and the arenas where this coalition will deploy next are already visible. Climate finance, the Loss and Damage Fund, demanding that industrialized nations pay for the climate impacts disproportionately borne by countries and contributed least to the problem. That is the exact same coalition, the exact same fault lines, the exact same argument structure. The reparation vote gives that coalition a playbook. IMF and World Bank reform. The U.S. holds veto power at the IMF with 16.5% of voting shares, designed to reflect American economic dominance in 1944. The U.S. share of global GDP is now under 25% and declining. The Global South wants the governance structure updated to reflect current reality. The A/80/L.48 coalition is the same coalition pushing that reform. This gives the vote that proves that they can coordinate. UN Security Council reform. Africa demands 2 permanent seats with veto power. The current P5 structure is a relic of 1945. 123 nations just demonstrated the diplomatic coordination needed to force the agenda. The AU's 51-0 discipline is directly applicable to any UNSC expansion vote. Sovereign debt restructuring. Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia. A new wave of sovereign debt crises, largely driven by Western-dominated creditor institutions charging rates that no developed country pays. The reparations framework reframes these as collections on outstanding historical obligations, not charity requests. That reframing has legal and diplomatic teeth. AI governance and digital infrastructure. The next technological order is being written now. Data sovereignty, AI regulation, undersea cable control, digital currency architecture. The Global South is moving to ensure it does not repeat the colonial extraction pattern in the digital domain. The same coalition, the same interests, the same fault lines. Reparations question will eventually move to the General Assembly, from the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice, to regional human rights courts, and into bilateral treaty negotiations. When it does, and I'm telling you it will, the voting record of March 25th, 2026 will be Exhibit A. The Global South is not waiting for Western permission to rewrite the rules. They just demonstrated they don't need it. What this means for Africa. Let me bring this home with what this actually means on the continent, not abstractly, concretely. First, the African Union's institutional power is no longer theoretical. A 51-0 vote on a contested geopolitical resolution is not an accident. It is the result of coordination and coordinated diplomacy and maintained discipline under pressure, and a willingness to let the text stand firm when Western powers tried to dilute it. The AU that delivered this vote is not the AU of 2005 or 2010. It is a maturing multilateral institution that is beginning to operate with the coherence and strategic purpose that its founding charter always promised but rarely delivered. African governments should be taking notes on how this was organized because the methodology is replicable. Second, China and Russia are now the default partners when the West retreats, and that is not ideology, it is gravity. Nations move toward whoever shows up. China shows up with infrastructure, trade, diplomatic solidarity. Russia shows up with security partnerships and weapons. The West shows up with conditions, delays, lectures on governance, and abstentions on historical justice. The choice of partners is not irrational. It is a rational response to demonstrated behavior. African governments that want leverage should be deepening relationships with Beijing and Moscow, not because those relationships are without cost, they're not, but because leverage requires alternatives. Third, the CFA franc system is in terminal decline. France has been militarily ejected from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in the span of 3 years. These are not random individual events, they are a regional pattern. The CFA franc, which has kept 14 West African nations' monetary sovereignty anchored to Paris since independence, is under sustained pressure from a new generation of African political leadership that has correctly identified it as the most durable mechanism of French economic control over its former colonies. France's abstention on this vote, coming on top of those military expulsions, signals that France-Afrique is not reforming, it is ending. West African nations should be building the monetary architecture to replace it. Fourth, reparations is now domestic political currency across the continent. Every ruling party in Africa now has an internationally endorsed resolution they can wave in front of a youth electorate that is growing fast and faster than any demographic on earth. Africa's median age, wait for it, is 19. Those voters want to know that their governments are not just administering inherited colonial structures, they are actively challenging them. A/80/L.48 is a mobilization tool, and sophisticated politicians across the continent will use it as one. Fifth, the diaspora leverage moment is here. African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Europeans, the descendants of 12.8 million, now have an international legal resolution they can point to in the domestic courts, legislative chambers, and street-level organizing. In the United States, Black voters are a decisive bloc on several swing states. In France, the Afro-French community is growing and increasingly politically activated. In the UK, the Caribbean community has been litigating this history for decades. A/80/L.48 hands all of them a moral anchor that did not exist 48 hours ago. Sixth, the legal precedent stack is compounding. Every subsequent nation that issues a formal apology, every partial reparations program, every bilateral treaty that includes language on historical accountability, all of it adds weight to legal architecture. International law does not move in straight lines. It moves through accumulation of precedent, which is then applied by courts and arbitration bodies that operate on longer timelines than election cycles. The clock on that process started ticking the moment the Secretary General's gavel came down on 123 votes. Africa is not waiting for the West to process this. Africa is building. Let me close with this one observation and one question. The observation: this was not a vote about history. History is not being debated. History is settled. What happened over 4 centuries to 12.8 million human beings is not a dispute by any serious historian, any serious legal scholar, or any serious geopolitical analyst. The facts are on record. What this vote is about is structure. Who bears responsibility for the consequences of those facts? Who has the leverage to extract that accountability? And who, right now in 2026, holds the moral authority that comes from being willing to say so out loud in front of the world? 123 countries said so out loud, 3 refused. The question, and this is the only question that matters going forward, is how fast does the structural reality catch up with the political reality? Because here is what I know about demographics and geography and time. Africa at 1.4 billion people today, on its way to 4 billion by the end of the century, producing the majority of the world's new workers, sitting on the majority of the world's uncultivated arable land, holding disproportionate shares of critical minerals that every green energy and technology transition on Earth requires. That Africa is not getting smaller. It is not getting poorer in relative terms as the demographic arithmetic of the rest of the world works against the countries that ran the slave trade. And it is not going to forget which way those 178 countries voted on March 25th, 2026. The arc does not bend. The question is not whether. The question is how fast. And the question for every government, every institution, every corporation that operates across the continent is, when the reckoning fully arrives, through courts, through treaties, through diplomatic and economic leverage, through the sheer weight of democratic and geopolitical reality, which side of this vote do you want to be on? 3 countries answered that question, 123 answered it differently. The record is public, the consequences are compounding, and the continent is watching. Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome to the Afrodescendant Ali channel. Once again, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll be bringing more of this to you as time goes on. Peace and blessing and much love. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Take care, everyone.